Hi, I'm here.
Sure, it's great to see you.
Hi, I'm on. Yeah. Can you hear
Yes,
me?
I can hear you great. We're going to just begin in a moment once I have
Okay.
everyone else. And hello to everyone else who's watching. Sure. Aaron, we haven't had the chance yet. Will you be needing screen sharing?
No.
No.
Very good. Okay. I think that's everyone. Very good. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all with us on this surprisingly warm February day. It may not look warm outside because there's snow coming down, but I promise you, it's a lot nicer than what we've had for the last few days. We're at an interesting time right now, a strange quiet before it feels like a storm in both what's going on in the Middle East and what's going on in Israel. And we are going to hear about that in great detail, I'm sure, today, amongst many other fascinating subjects. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to be with you right before Shabbat and to wish you all Shabbat Shalom. And with that, I'm going to hand it directly to David so that he can introduce our guests.
Thanks, Rabbi. Hey, thanks very much. And it's really a pleasure today to be able to welcome back two remarkable individuals who've been with us before. Uh, those who are regular followers of Israel Dialogues will know both Asher Susser and Aaron Miller from previous conversations, as well as Usher has for a very long time been a stalwart friend and contributor to the Israel Dialogues. Uh, Very briefly, uh, Aaron David Miller is one of America's leading scholars. He's been an advisor to the White House. He's been in the State Department, worked with numerous administrations on Middle East policy, on American foreign policy, on U.S. Israel engagement, on the peace process. And he's the author of a series of important articles, um, often found in Foreign Affairs and elsewhere, and earlier books. And Asher Susser is one of Israel's most distinguished historians of the contemporary Middle East, and a former director of the Dayan Center of Middle East and African Studies at Tel Aviv University. And it's really a pleasure to have them with us. The format is unusual because we've invited Asher and Aaron to enter into a conversation. They're each going to start with some opening remarks, and my colleagues on screen and I will then raise some questions. And our hope is that Asher and Aaron and Asher will engage one another as the conversation evolves. And for those of you who are on screen, we invite you through the Q&A to please submit your comments or questions, and we'll try and ensure that there's time for Aaron and Asher to consider those as well. So for now, Let me first invite Aaron David Miller, currently with the Carnegie Endowment, to thank you, Aaron, because I know that you're busy. You have your own webinar series. You are often on CNN. You're called on by many others, so it's good of you to give us your time and to teach us. And then we'll turn to Usher, who will then provide some insight from where he sits in Tel Aviv. Aaron, screen's yours. Thank you.
David, thanks so much. It's great to be here with everybody, too, with Asher. I miss our conversations. First, let me make something unmistakably clear. I don't normally believe in transformations, sea changes, inflection points, game changers. The media and many analysts have a way of responding to events with this sort of breathless, sort of grandiose cosmic notion that after an event, the world will never be the same again. We were told in the wake of COVID, life would be fundamentally altered. Then there was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was going to rearrange international politics in a way that would never be the same. Then it was October 7th, which would produce a Middle East that was unrecognizable. Either much good might have come or much that wasn't good. There have been changes, to be sure, but life and diplomacy, in my judgment, my experience, is more about transactions, incremental evolutionary changes, than it is in terms of dramatic changes, particularly dramatic change for the better. Let me make 7 or 8 quick observations. I'm going to 10 minutes, I promise, 10 minutes. And then I will leave the issue of the Trump administration and Israel, the U.S.-Israeli relationship, for further discussion. But I think we need to look at the world the way it is, with a degree of clarity and honesty, before we could begin to assess trying to fashion the world the way we want it to be. Now, this is my rendition. Asher may disagree, other analysts may disagree, but let me just do a sort of quick regional tour. First, Iran. It's a headline, and it's likely to remain a trend line as well. Reports indicate that the first round, we have not heard from the Americans yet, of the negotiations in Oman between head of CENTCOM, Brad Cooper, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner. The Omanis are talking about these negotiations as having positive results. The Gulf clearly has an interest in minimizing or preventing the prospects of U.S. strikes. What came out of them, what could possibly come out of them to rationalize or justify for a president who has basically locked himself into a box by promising the Iranians help is on the way, Caesar institutions will hit the Iranians hard. He's assembled quite a formidable deployment of American military hardware, including a carrier strike group, 3 missile launching capable destroyers, advanced wings of F-15s, F-35s, and he has the recourse, as we saw in June, of using B-52 bombers. We're going to have to wait to see what the American reaction to this is. But Iran will be very much a part of the conversation going forward. Second, Syria, a rather extraordinary degree of developments beginning last year in December. And my question on Syria, of course, is, will Syria prove to be the exception? That is to say, the exception of an Arab state that got rid of a cruel authoritarian and a dictator. Will Syria's future, the trend lines, be different than Egypt in the Arab Spring, which produced the authoritarian rule of Abdel Fattah Sisi, larger numbers of political prisoners jailed? Libya, after Gaddafi, which is dysfunctional, a state divided into at least two parts. Yemen in the wake of Abdullah Saleh, Saddam in the wake of Iraq in the wake of Saddam. More functionality there in terms of Iraq. But could Syria actually produce a relatively stable, functional Arab state with some measure of inclusion, control over all of its borders? Remains to be seen. Some argue that Ahmed Shara is a jihadi in a suit. his detractors to be sure, showing a lot of pragmatism, Israeli-Syrian negotiations towards some sort of security agreement. We'll put a pin in that one. 3, Gaza. Look, with different leaders, it might be possible to imagine better governance, better security, better prosperity for the 2 million Palestinians who reside in an area roughly twice the size of the District of Columbia with one of the highest population densities in the world. But it seems to me, for any number of reasons, one in particular, a fundamental and irreconcilable difference on the part of how Hamas sees the end state and how the current Israeli government does, and perhaps even other Israeli governments. We haven't been able to crack that. No mediator has been able to reconcile that division, and I don't think any mediators will. Gaza, in my mind, the war as we've known it is over, but Gaza is going to remain, in my judgment, divided, dysfunctional, and sporadically violent. Caesar famously said Gaul was divided into 3 parts. Well, Gaza, seems to me, is going to harden the divisions into 2. The Arab world writ large, largely a measure, in my judgment, of state failure and dysfunction. You have at least 3 Arab states, Libya, Yemen, and Lebanon. I won't describe them as failed states, failing states, but they're highly dysfunctional, where you have no governance or bad governance. And as the Arab world has diminished, it seems to be in functionality, where the 3 previous states, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, the 3 key Arab states that competed for influence and power, in my judgment, these 3 Arab states are offline. They cannot project their power beyond their borders in ways that they used to. And a large gap has been created. That gap has now been filled mainly by the Gulf. We can talk about the Saudis and the Emiratis, Qataris later, but the Gulf is the thing. There's no question about it, certainly for an American president and for American policy. The other gap filler has been, in my judgment, the rise, even with Iran's weakness, the rise of the 3 non-Arabs. If you were to ask me who are the 3 most consequential states in this region today, I would say they are the 3 non-Arabs: Israel, Turkey, and Iran. All have tremendous economic potential, all have extraordinarily competent militaries and security organizations. One is a member of NATO, one is America's closest ally, more on that later. One, Iran, is a pariah, and at least in terms of American view, although highly functional still, and it will remain, Iran, even in its weakened state, will remain a key part of the conversation of this region, along with the other 2 non-Arabs. Just a few more points. On the broader Palestinian issue, let me be unmistakably clear. In my mind, separation through negotiations is the only way to deal with the only useful deployment of the phrase river to the sea. The only useful deployment of the phrase river to the sea is what to do about the 16 million humans that live between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. There was a time I was part of the negotiations at Camp David 25 years ago. But those negotiations based on resolving 5 key issues: border security, refugees, Jerusalem, and end of all conflict and claims. Those negotiations, the prospects of a Palestinian state bounded, circumscribed, and fulfilling a conception of a sovereign state, it's going to be excruciatingly painful, if even possible, to return to the negotiations for an outcome like that. I think that the paradox, the cruel paradox of October 7 was it, in many respects, for the world, for the region, for the United States, demonstrated the centrality of the Israeli-Palestinian issue and the Palestinian cause, but we find ourselves 3 years in, light years away from any resolution of that cause. And the 3 power centers, I might add, in the world, in the face of unbelievable trauma. First, on October 7, the willful and indiscriminate killing of civilians, the sexual predation, the mutilation, the taking of hostages, and Israel's response. The IDF recently seems to have agreed with the Hamas-controlled Palestinian Ministry of Health, 70,000+ Palestinians have been killed, even if you deducted 25, 30,000 Hamas fighters, you're left with a high proportion of civilian deaths and casualties. Humanitarian catastrophe. Despite all of that urgency, despite all of it, neither the international community, nor the Arab world, nor the United States could find a way, any way, to bring a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian problem closer. And if in the face of that kind of urgency and focus, these power centers could not bring us any closer, under what circumstances would the world pay attention? I don't know the answer to that question, but the Israeli-Palestinian issue solution of which I think is out to sea right now. One comment on the U.S. and the region, and then I'll conclude. I think the predicament for the United States is that we are trapped between transformation on a region we can't transform on one hand, and a region we cannot extricate ourselves from on the other. It is between transformation on one hand and extrication on the other that the U.S. must find its way in this region. And as FDR said about Lincoln, that Lincoln died a sad man because he couldn't have everything. The United States cannot have everything in the Middle East. We must divide, I think, our interests into what I call the must-haves, those that pertain to American security and prosperity, from the it would be nice to haves. And the it would be nice to haves are important issues. The degree to which the United States can and will participate in dealing with any of the conflicts in the region and the difficulties and challenges are unclear. So let me stop here, and I'm sure we'll return to a discussion of Israel and equally fascinating Trump and Israel.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks very much. Asher, over to you, and let me remind people who are viewing, if you have questions or comments, please enter them into the Q&A. Asher, screen's yours.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, Aaron, for a brilliant overview, a hard act to follow. I want to make 3 observations. The Abraham Accords in retrospect, between the Arabs and the non-Arab powers, which is a certain overlap with some of the things that Aaron has said. And the third is Arab views of Israel after the war. And I start with the Abraham Accords in retrospect. I cannot forget the smug faces of Netanyahu's trumpets on Israeli television on the signing of the Abraham Accords, that this was proof positive that the left was completely wrong and that one could make peace with the Arabs without having to solve the Palestinian question. The Palestinian issue is not a necessary component of peace with the Arabs. This was an illusion that was washed away in what the Hamas calls the Al-Aqsa flood. And Israelis, on the eve of the war, were standing in expectation for Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel. And Israelis were asking themselves, do the Saudis really care about the Palestinians? Do they really need some progress on the Palestinian question in order to normalize with Israel? Well, they were asking the wrong question. The Saudis don't really care about the Palestinians. But what they do care about very deeply is regional stability. And regional stability depends to a large degree, as 7th of October showed only too clearly, does depend on some progress, important progress, some outline of a vision on the Palestinian question. And the Saudis went together, clubbed together with the French on the French-Saudi initiative in September 25 on the two-state solution. There is an unprecedented international consensus on the two-state solution. Although I agree entirely with Aaron that this is a solution that is still very far away, but there is a consensus on this, as there has not been before. And there is an understanding which goes way beyond the Middle East that it will be very difficult to achieve regional stability without some serious progress on the Palestinian issue. The second, the story of between the Arabs and the non-Arab powers. For decades it has been true that the notion that the Middle East and the Arab world are coterminous is way out of date and has been out of date for a quarter of a century, more or less. As Aaron mentioned, the region is dominated by the three non-Arab states, Iran, Turkey, and Israel. And the major shifts in the regional balance of power are not between the Arabs and Israel, or between the Arabs and the non-Arabs, but between the non-Arab players themselves. That is what has changed since the retreat of Iran. There is, I agree with Aaron, great importance to the Gulf. But the great wealth of the Saudis, Qatar, and the UAE cannot compensate for their relative military weakness. So in the balance of power between the non-Arab powers, Iran is obviously in retreat after decades of a very costly confrontation with the West and Israel. The 12-day war with Israel and the US, the defeat of Hezbollah, the fall of Assad, the collapse of the Shia axis, all of these have affected Iran's regional clout. The debilitating consequences of sanctions, corruption, poor management of infrastructure, the inability to supply the basics of water and energy for a population that has doubled since the revolution. And Turkey is filling the vacuum of Iranian and Arab weakness. This is a revolutionary turn in Turkish foreign policy, which has emerged under Erdogan. It is not that long ago that Turkey was aspiring to join the European Union, but with the void of Arab weakness breathing down its neck, Turkey's Islamic identity and the weakness of the Arabs have made the Middle Eastern hinterland a critically important venue for Turkish influence. The weakness of the Arabs has much greater impact on Turkish foreign policy than whatever may happen in Brussels. And with the emergence of Turkey as a stronger regional power than before, more involved in regional affairs, Israel and Turkey meet each other in Syria. The Turks moving southwards into the Syrian vacuum, which has yet to stabilize, and Israel moving northwards to protect itself from the fallout of Syrian instability. Turkey is now portrayed in Israel as the new relevant enemy. And it seems as if Netanyahu is about to repeat his Iranian style of confrontation rather than seeking a diplomatic solution to the difficulties with Turkey. Netanyahu made a career out of Iran, leading us up to the point where we presently face the unsavory prospect of a multi-round war of attrition. In the new balance of power between the non-Arab states, Iran has been beaten back. But Israel has not defeated Iran, as they prepare, as Israel does, for the next round. Israel has beaten Hamas, but there is no total victory. And the same is true with Hezbollah. Israel has emerged victorious, but exhausted, suffering from manpower shortages, huge human and economic costs of war, and international isolation, the likes of which we have never seen. And the last comment, the Arab views of Israel after the war. And this is unpleasant reading, I prepare you for it. Israel is the land of expulsion and genocide. After the Israeli attack on Doha in Qatar, much talk about the criminality of the Israeli state. Israel's international isolation. Israel's partial victories, as Israel now emerges as an American protectorate. These are the four main lines of discourse in the Arab media. I'll take the first, Israel, the land of expulsion and genocide. There are two words in Arabic which are all over the place. Tahjir, expulsion, ibada, genocide. The regional impact of the war in Gaza, the huge destruction in Gaza, coupled with the settler violence in the West Bank. Israel threatens its neighbors, those who have peace treaties with it, Egypt and Jordan. The threat of expulsion endangers the peace treaties, as the Egyptians and the Jordanians will tell you. And Israel has not given up on the idea of transferring the population from Gaza. The Israelis sit and wait for the Trump initiative to fail. And the Arabs fear that once that happens, Israel will renew the idea of transferring the population. At the same time, Israel is collapsing the Palestinian Authority, leaving the Palestinians leaderless, rudderless, no leadership of Hamas in the West Bank that has, of Hamas in Gaza that has an international recognition, and as the Palestinian Authority weakens and declines in the West Bank. Netanyahu and others in Israel speak repeatedly of the policy that Israel will not allow the creation of a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. Now just imagine, if you sit in Amman and you hear the Prime Minister of Jordan saying, Israel will not allow the creation of a Palestinian state west of the Jordan. So maybe he means east of the Jordan. Jordanians understand that kind of talk as a threat on their physical existence. The impact of the attack on Doha. Israel, the argument goes, is the main source of regional instability. The US cannot really protect its allies from Israeli aggression, and the Arab states fear Iran and Israel equally. There are Arab observers, writers on Arab politics, people who I'm sure Aaron knows very well, like Marwan Muasher and Abdul Munim Said from Egypt, Marwan Muasher from Jordan, who were pivots in their societies in the making of peace with Israel. Today they speak of Israel as a country that can no longer be trusted as one devoted to peace. Israel is militarily dominant. It can do more or less as it pleases. But Israeli brutality is described as an indication of the frustration of Israel's inability to achieve total victory. So there is an internal contradiction here. On the one hand, Israel can do as it pleases, but on the other hand, it hasn't been able to achieve total victory. The impact of Israel's international isolation. Israel is an unpredictable state that believes solely in the use of force. And the attack on Qatar was a catalyst to Israel's isolation, which is the worst in its history. The consequent expansion of the international consensus on Palestinian statehood and the two-state solution is the greatest achievement of the war. So the argument goes in the Arab media. Israel is losing its international legitimacy. Israel is a colonial criminal state. It is at a historical turning point in terms of its international standing. And here I add a comment of my own, not from the Arab press, but from my own study of the region's history. Israel's international legitimacy has always rested on the idea of partition. From the Balfour Declaration to the partition resolutions of 37 and 47, to Resolution 242 and the UN from then on, Israel's legitimacy has always been based on the acceptance of partition. The international community has never recognized that all of Palestine belongs to the Jews. And as the Balfour Declaration declared, a national home for the Jews in Palestine, not the conversion of Palestine into a Jewish national home. And as the international consensus on Palestine takes hold, Israel embarks on further bouts of violence, coupled with endless pronouncements on annexation, in an effort to eventually make Palestinian statehood impossible. Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister of England, had a defense minister called Dennis Healey. And Dennis Healey used to say, when you're in a hole, stop digging. Well, Israel is in a hole and it is not stopping digging. And it's only deepening its international isolation and legitimacy. And if we continue down this road, further down this pathway, doesn't await a two-state solution, but the evolution of international legitimacy on a one-state solution and not in Israel's favor. And lastly, and with that I conclude, Israel's partial victories have created a situation where Israel is turning into a US protectorate. A US protectorate, on the one hand, to protect the US interests from Israeli folly, and on the other hand, to save Israel from itself. And I will end here. Thank you.
Moshe, as always, thank you. Thoughtful, insightful, and yes, very challenging. Thank you. Before I turn to my colleagues on the screen, I really would like to try and begin with a conversation between Aaron and Asher, between the two of you. And in this, clearly, you both recognize the remarkable history of the US-Israel relationship that some have called not special, but rather exceptional, and that it's been at times mutually advantageous, but at times also constraining. And it seems to me, Asher, that your final comments are suggesting that just as the last years has in many ways weakened Israel, certainly in view of both the Arab world and the international community in terms of the norms and principles we once stood for, and the aspirations that many of us have had for Israel as a liberal democratic state. So Aaron's comments raise lots of questions about not just the shifting balance of power within the Arab world and within the larger Middle East, therefore in Turkey and Iran and Israel, but how that affects U.S. interests, how that distorts or creates new opportunities or new needs and new demands, and what is the cost? What is the cost to Israel and to the United States, and having to address the new imbalances that seem to be that have emerged and seem not readily resolvable, because so many things seem to be in play at the same time. Asher and Aaron, you both mentioned Syria as a meeting point of those forces, but surely Lebanon and its weakness, what's happening in the Gulf, the question of what can the Iranians do about Iran, and what do those who worry about Iran from the outside, and the pressure and the demands and the expectations. So there's lots of movement, it seems, and I'm wondering if the two of you were now in positions to have a conversation in front of your respective political leaders and trying to forge what an insightful policy would be, where would your entry point be?
But can I first of all, let me just react to Asher's presentation, which
Please.
only he could have done. It's really extraordinary. Not only was it eloquent, steeped in history, it sparks so many. Traveling down the main highway, there's so many exit ramps we could get off on to comment on the sheer brilliance and acuity of analysis of what Asher had to say. I mean, Dave, let me just try to make a few points here. First of all, there's not a single problem in this entire region, not one, and I would defy any of you to identify any problem in this region that you believed had a determinative or definitive resolution. This is about management.
Mm.
The Russia-Ukraine war, next week the 24th will be the 4th anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine war. It is no closer to resolution. It surpasses in violence and in loss of life all of the Arab-Israeli wars and conflicts. It has dominated the headline. Putin is putatively described as a pariah, a war criminal. And yet, the conflict continues. I mentioned at the outset, I do not believe in that politics and transformations are rare. Sadat and Begin, Mandela and de Klerk, the end of apartheid in South Africa. The notion of transformational ending, seeking solutions that are fundamentally conflict enders, I don't think that's what we're talking about here. You could count on your hands, one hand probably, maybe two if you stretched, the number of true transformative diplomatic breakthroughs that the United States has driven and presided over since the end of the Second World War. Those sorts of endings are rare in life because the leaders that are necessary to produce them, that's what greatness. I wrote a book called The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. Greatness is extraordinary because it is rare. It exceeds expectations in an extraordinary way. That's my first comment. Second, I would only draw to Asher's attention and everyone's that despite the Israel's pariah status, its colonial, the way it is perceived as a colonial state, occupation, genocide, and expulsion. During the last 3 years, not a single cost or consequence of a determinative nature was imposed either by the international community in the three core states in Europe that the Israelis care about, the French, the Germans, and the Brits. Not a single cost or consequence was imposed by them that interfered with or fundamentally pushed Israel into pariah status. The Arab states, neither Israel's treaty partners, and geography is destiny here for the Jordanians and the Egyptians. Not a single cost was imposed on Israel or the United States by Israel's treaty partners as they watched scores of thousands of Palestinians in an IDF policy of risk transfer, and nor did the Gulf states. or the United States for that matter, impose a single cost or consequence during the Biden administration or during the first 10 months of the Trump administration. So I don't know what the relationship is. The world's attention span is very limited. What has happened now, paradoxically, in the implementation of phase 1 of Gaza, is that in returning the hostages, 20 live and the bodies of 28 Israelis, in limiting the war that, as Israel waged it, 500 plus Palestinians have been killed in Israeli. The tempo of IDF strikes have increased. We're not talking about the thousands of Palestinians. Reports of famine, starvation are now much lessened, and the food insecurity has improved. I don't want to paint a positive picture of Gaza. Shelter is an unbelievably horrible issue in Gaza right now. But the three reasons anyone cared about Gaza to begin with, hostages, thousands of Palestinians being killed by Israelis, starvation and famine. The urgency of Gaza has been sucked out of it. And I'm just wondering whether or not the world's conscience, its attention span will be maintained. And I don't know the answer to that question. And finally, two additional points. Asher points, I think, with quite correctly, to looming Israeli and Turkish interests, which are somehow dividing in Syria. But can you imagine America's closest ally and a NATO member going to war with one another? Maybe through proxies, but not directly. And just finally, the one point that I think really does matter. November was the 30th anniversary of Rabin's murder. What is required here, even for management, are leaders who are masters of their politics and leaders who have the capacity to see beyond those politics, to think about the well-being and security and prosperity of their respective peoples. Those leaders do not exist in Israel right now. The leadership crisis in the Palestinian national movement is acute. And Washington and Donald Trump, we can talk about this in a minute, as much as there would have been no hostages released without Donald Trump. Donald Trump did something that no American president has ever done. None that I worked for, from Jimmy Carter to Bush 43. No American president ever talked to an Israeli prime minister the way that Trump has talked to Netanyahu. Nor is an Israeli prime minister more dependent on an American president to achieve his major goal in 2026, which is re-election, than Netanyahu is on Donald Trump. So it's a unique sort of relationship now, with extraordinary leverage on the part of the United States. Whether it will be deployed or not to lessen all of the extraordinarily almost tragic problems and challenges that Asher has referred to, I can't say. But leadership, even for management of any of these issues, is going to be critical.
Yeah, well, I agree with Aaron on the points that he has made on all of them. Just two things I would say, one on the management issue and the other about, how important is, Israel's isolation in real terms. On the management issue, I think Trump and Netanyahu may be leaning towards an agreement based on managing the problem with Iran, mainly Trump, not Netanyahu. And this fear that there is in Israel, that Trump may come to an agreement rather than going to war with Iran, is based, I think, on the fear that there may be an agreement which we would call an intermediary agreement. It's one that's not going to resolve all the issues between the United States and Iran. The US will not get all it and Israel wish to achieve on the nuclear and on the ballistic missiles and on the proxies. But there is, if Trump and Netanyahu were to seek Aaron's advice, there are people here, some in Israeli media commentators, who have said that there is no possibility of an end of conflict agreement between Israel and Iran, but rather some kind of intermediate arrangement. But that already would be a major departure from what has been Israeli policy until now. And I would say the same about Israel-Turkey. I agree with you. The chances of Israel and Turkey as allies of the United States and Turkey, a member of NATO, going to war with each other is remote. One doesn't have to go to war to create constant tension in Syria. And here we and Turkey are at loggerheads. We support things that they don't support. They want a strong central government and we don't. We're supporting the Druze, we supported the Kurds until the Turks and the Syrians achieved what they achieved just very recently. So we are at loggerheads with the Turks. And I would say here too, Israel has to be pushed into the direction of seeking these kinds of interim agreements, managing the problems we have with Iran and with Turkey, not solving. You're not going to solve the problem of the Palestinians either. But there is no chance of a settlement with the Palestinians presently. But Israel can refrain from taking all the negative actions it takes on a daily basis in order to make a future agreement impossible. That is something Israel can do and should be encouraged to do. This constant criminal violence, I can't describe it in any other way, of the settlers against the Palestinians in the West Bank has to stop. It doesn't further any purpose that is in Israel's long-term interest. As for Israel's isolation, I can tell you one thing that we feel in the universities, and we feel it strongly, is international isolation. Projects are cancelled. The university presidents in Israel struggle to keep their faculty in Israel, not to emigrate, to get postdocs who are studying abroad to come back. There is much more difficulty to have Israel doing as it did by the nature of things in terms of international cooperation in scientific research. That has very serious long-term ramifications for Israel as a first world nation. And if Israel is not a first world nation, then Israel's future as some kind of third world concoction here in the Middle East is not very bright, to put it mildly. So it's not the top of the heap, but it's an indication of a problem that seeps into Israel's longevity, as does the emigration from Israel, the brain drain, which, by the way, the Arab states watch very carefully and note in their analyses of Israeli weaknesses, of course, is top of the list. So these are issues that we have to contend with without resolving anything in terms of finality, but going towards an interim arrangement of managing the crisis rather than exacerbating it.
Pastor, as long as I have you, let me ask you, because it's troubled me. I talk to people I know and respect who are adamantly persuaded that the possibility of reconciling a Jewish state with a democratic one is simply not possible. I do not believe this. I choose not to believe it. At 76 years old, almost 77, I choose not to believe it. And I argue Israel's turning, 78 in May. You could argue that neither the borders of the state of Israel nor the identity of the state of Israel are accepted by the majority of the 10 million, just shy of 10 million people who live within the state of Israel. Now, I would argue back that at 78, what's that, roughly 1848, neither the borders of the state of Israel, of the United States, nor the identity of the United States were yet fixed 78 years after independence. It took another century, more than another century, and a civil war to put the United States on a different path. And much of those tensions and challenges, particularly with respect to racial equality and how minorities are treated in this country, remains unresolved. So I agree there is no conflict resolution, no conflict ending solution of the Israeli-Palestinian problem. Leadership could begin to change matters. So your sense here, I know you said that Benjamin Netanyahu could be reelected with a different Israeli government, presumably. But if Benjamin Netanyahu is not reelected and you get a different Israeli prime minister on the core issues, Gaza, annexationist policies on the West Bank, Syria. Remember, we now have Israeli-Syrian negotiations under U.S. auspices, not to talk about the return of the Golan Heights. We tried for years to get Assad and the Israelis together on something short of that. Neither of the Assads would agree to it. Ahmed Shara has agreed. So would a different Israeli prime minister, an Naftali Bennett, for example, take your advice that when you're in a hole, stop digging? Could the policies of the next Israeli government on the core issues that generate tension, isolation, anger toward Israel, could those improve to a degree that you and I, as normal humans, Asher, would say, hey, things are headed at least in a different direction? Is that possible?
If I take the year and a bit that Bennett was prime minister together with Yair Lapid, it wasn't revolutionary, but things did improve.
Yes.
Things did improve dramatically, for example, in relations between Israel and Jordan, between Israel and Egypt. The amount of hostility towards Netanyahu doesn't exist amongst the Arab leaders versus the potential leaders of a new government in Israel. So it's not revolutionary, but in reference to Israel as a democracy and a Jewish state as a democratic state, Jewish and democratic, it depends on how democratic Israel really intends to be and what the present interpretation of this government of being Jewish is not democratic.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case before. Doesn't have to be the case in the future either. And what this government is doing in eroding the democratic system here in order to secure its own political survival is undermining Israeli democracy for Israeli Jews too, not just for the relationship between Arabs and Jews. I mean, that is something that could change. What won't change is if we have a repetition of the present government.
Yeah.
Then we're, as I think, heading for a rather unsavory prospect of, let's say, increasing difficulties, to put it mildly.
Okay, both Norm and John have questions. So if I could just invite each of them and then leave it to you to respond, if I might.
So you want me to go first?
Sure, Norm and then John.
I am troubled by this whole idea of the pariah nature of Israel, because I look at the trade balances. Israel has huge trade balances. The currency is strong. Israel is selling arms to Germany, to India. The money's coming into the trade sector at a tremendous clip. And I see all this money coming in and all this activity and all this expansion, and that's can only be done with the rest of the world. So maybe the diplomats are looking at Israel in a pariah way, but the defense departments in Germany and India are not. They're looking at to buy more and more of their military and aerospace products. So I'm having trouble understanding pariah outside of the diplomatic or outside of the universities, because the bigger world, it doesn't seem to be so adverse because it's buying Israel's products at a tremendous rate. So I like to sort of have your perception on.
I'd leave to Asher the question of how the rest of the world is responding to Israel as a pariah. I'll only make a couple points on the U.S. I always said Israel can't afford to alienate its adversaries. It cannot afford to alienate its friends. My definition of a U.S. ally, apart from the treaty relationship, which we do not have with Israel, we have with the Philippines, with South Korea and Japan, and with our NATO commitments, Article 5. We do not have a treaty relationship with Israel. Outside of a treaty ally, I would define an ally of the United States using three metrics. Number one, is there a high coincidence of values between the United States and its ally? Number two, is there a high coincidence of interest? There is no strict coincidence of interest between any nations. And number three, in a democratic polity where voters have agency, a sustainable basis of domestic support is critically important. France, Germany, Australia, Canada, Japan, South Korea, allies of the United States, in my judgment, according to those three metrics. I have not seen and I'm a proponent of a special relationship with Israel, not an exclusive relationship. When the U.S. has an exclusive relationship with Israel, we lose our credibility, we lose our independence, we lose our capacity to change. But I've been a defender of a special relationship because of value affinity. You could count on one hand the number of nations that have emerged since the end of the Second World War that have maintained their democratic character continuously. Neither Turkey nor India are on the list. And as a consequence of democratic backsliding in this country, we may not be on the list either. But those three elements, it's not time for what I call the cosmic oy vey, the fragmentation of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. But those three metrics are under severe stress in this country. And you're right to point out, I use the iceberg as the image. Above the waterline, the third of the iceberg's mass above the waterline, things are functional, extraordinarily functional for all the reasons you say with respect to the United States, highly functional. Below the waterline, the mass that is not in the hands of politicians, presidents, diplomats, below the waterline, things are changing. And they're changing because of a very bad interaction between the current prime minister of Israel, the longest governing prime minister in the history of the Israeli state, and the current American president. There is a toxic affinity which is eroding democratic values in Israel and democratic values here. I worry greatly about a younger generation, about younger American politicians who are growing up with the image of Israel formed since October 7th. I mean, most young Israeli, a 20-year-old Israeli forgets what it was even like in the 90s when you had extraordinary integration. So I worry about the trend lines here. Asher, over to you.
Yeah, I agree, very much with what you've, just said. It's true. Israel's defense industries have done some fantastic deals recently, and Israel is not under any kind of embargo or boycott in terms of arms supplies. And the Israeli economy is certainly doing fairly well. However, what is really at stake here is not that, but what Aaron called the 2/3 of the iceberg below the water. And this has to do with values. And most countries don't have to worry about values, but Israel does. Israel is unique. I would say almost unique in its necessity to justify its existence. Israel was created in very abnormal circumstances. For many years, Israel dreamed of having the 67 boundaries recognized as Israel's international boundaries. After 67, they were. But then Israel said that that's not enough anymore. We struggle with international legitimacy. And after Gaza, we're struggling more than ever. And even though we sell missiles to Germany, we've got a problem with European public opinion, as we have with US public opinion. And the public opinion of the West is very important to us, as is our relationship with the scientific and intellectual community of the West. Even in financial terms, certainly in terms of Israel as a first world nation, as I mentioned before. So I think we have to look beyond that. And if we have arms deals with India, which we've had for a long time, that's all very well. But that is not an explanation, nor a justification for Israel to take the back seat and let the international community turn against it. If you look at what has emerged as the international consensus on Palestinian statehood, and where Israel is as a government in relation to that international consensus, that is not a position we've ever been in, and not one that is, I would say, advantageous to Israel in the longer term. We do have to be very concerned about that. And as I said before, in the universities, we feel this very clearly. We have a special vice president of the university to deal just with this. That's her job, to deal with the international boycott.
Okay, thank you. We have more questions, not only on screen, but I have more with people writing in. So let me turn to John, then I'll turn to Mark, and then I'll try and address some of the questions that have been submitted. John?
Okay, thanks, Asher. Thanks, Aaron, very much. Appreciate your wisdom. So my question really follows up on this question of boycotts, actually. Mark Carney came into power, and very soon after, he and a number of Europeans criticized Israel for what was going on in the West Bank and in Gaza. That was in a joint declaration. Then there was a second joint declaration that Canada joined in with a different group. And there was a third. And then we had the New York Declaration, which was mentioned, where there was as mentioned, a consensus that two states was the only way to go. And it was followed by recognition by Canada, by the UK, by France, etc. And of course, a number of other countries. But since then, the only way the war stopped, there was a ceasefire broken by Israel, and then finally Trump put his foot down, and we get a ceasefire. Yes, 400 deaths or 500 in Gaza since then, but what's going on in the West Bank is completely contrary to the idea of a two-state solution, especially with E1, which will divide the West Bank. So my question is, if you two were advising your leaders in the West, what would you do? You have Bibi Netanyahu and his messianic ministers essentially thumbing their nose at everybody and saying, we don't give a damn what you say. We don't care about your views on two states, and we are going to do everything possible as fast as possible to prevent that. If Bibi's reelected, that could be the physical end of two states. So my question is, what should the West be doing? Should they not be imposing sanctions? Because I'm not sure that sanctions would work with Bibi, but they might work with the rest of Israel saying, we can't continue with Bibi. Everybody is reluctant to impose sanctions. First of all, it would hurt the universities, it would hurt the arts community, it would hurt the lefties that don't support Bibi. But on the other hand, what does the international community do in the face of these actions, which could, mean the end of a Palestinian state? Thanks.
I don't know how to put this. The United States abides by international law when it serves its interests, and it doesn't abide by international law when it chooses not to, because it doesn't serve its interests. The international community, I think there is no precedent for the vaunted international community, the International Court of Justice, the ICC, to fundamentally, when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, act as a collective body to impose anything on anybody. I can't speak for the West. I can speak for the United States. In my own commentary, I try to drop the word should from my vocabulary, because I know how easy it is once you're out of office, out of the ears of policymakers. I wasn't a decision maker, I was an advisor. I know how difficult it is to be in government, having to contend not with choices between good and bad, but choices between bad and worse. Donald Trump is not your ordinary, normal American president. He has no clear conception of what I would call the national interest. The New York Times referred to him the other day, quoting an academic, as a neo-royalist. His conception of the national interest is subordinated and tethered to his whims and fancies, his economic interests, his financial interests, his political interests, or whatever moves him on any given day or time. He is not interested, in my judgment, of getting into a major confrontation with the current Prime Minister of Israel. He was prepared in October, largely because of the strike on Doha, where the people he does care about in this region, the Qataris, the Emiratis, and the Saudis, because the amount of self-dealing and corruption that this president has presided over and participated in is head exploding. He cares about the Gulf states. He cares about them because he's comfortable with them as authoritarians. He cares about them because there was the scene of his greatest diplomatic triumph with the Abraham Accords. He cares about them because of his financial interests. He's going to get a retrofitted 747 that he is paying hundreds of millions of dollars to have fitted with the proper security instruments that he will probably use before he begins his post-presidential career. The Gulf cared about the Doha strike. So Trump cared about it. And he finally decided to tell the Prime Minister of Israel, enough. If you do not agree with this 20-point plan, quote, we will walk away from you, unquote. But he's not interested in getting into a major row with Netanyahu over an issue right now that he understands is not going to win him a Nobel. Mohammed bin Salman made it unmistakably clear during his recent visit, and got a lot, by the way, without agreeing to even the hint of normalization with Israel. He got a lot. So MBS has walked away thinking, I don't have to do this now. I'm going to be king of Saudi. The average tenure of a Saudi king is 13 years. They've had 7 of them, including Salman. This man will rule Saudi Arabia for 50 years. He's pursuing a 360-degree foreign policy. Be friends with everybody. The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, other than the Emiratis. That's another subject right now. But Donald Trump doesn't care about Palestinians. Donald Trump freed Israeli hostages, alive and dead. He ended the war in a way no other American president could have. And right now, he's got Russia, Ukraine. He's got Iran. The ceasefire is quote unquote holding. Might there come a time, John, where Trump would, and he's told Netanyahu, the red line is no formal annexation. You will not annex the West Bank. But he has not been willing to constrain or contain Israel's pro-annexationist policy, land confiscation, settler violence, and terror. He's allowed it to continue because it doesn't really, he's a transactional guy. It doesn't meet the needs of the moment, as ending the war in Gaza did. He had a problem with a group of people he cared about. He had to fix it. He fixed it. He knows he has leverage over Netanyahu. And I might add one last point. He is different than any other American president that I knew and worked for. And I would throw Obama and Joe Biden into this as well. Number one, he does not have the emotional entanglements. He did not say, as Bill Clinton said to us, I loved Rabin as I had loved no man. He did not grieve as Bill Clinton grieves in the wake of Rabin's death. He did not declare himself as a Christian Zionist. He's not Joe Biden. He's freed himself from those emotional entanglements. But more important, he has more political running room than any other Republican and Democratic president has ever had because he owns the Republican Party. And in owning the Republican Party, he denies Netanyahu a higher court of appeals. Benjamin Netanyahu has nowhere else to go in America if he doesn't like what Trump has to say. The evangelicals, he can't go there. Not anymore. He can go to Lindsey Graham and a few others. But the opposition in the Republican Party to being tough with Israel, I mean, you know what Candace Owen, Charlie Kirk, and Tucker Carlson think on this issue. They're tougher on Israel than he is. So I think Donald Trump has this leverage, and Netanyahu needs him. But in my judgment, until Benjamin Netanyahu goes again, puts the president and what he cares about at risk, he's not going to sanction Israel.
Now, to John's question.
And then just briefly, and then I want to make sure I get Mark and Shai so I can get others.
Yeah, I just want to make one very brief comment on John's question. I have to confess here, I'm an Israeli through and through, for better or for worse. I cannot bring myself to say, Canada should impose sanctions on Israel. I can't do it. And nor can I say that about any other country. What I can say is that I think all countries who have opinions on what it is that Israel should or shouldn't be doing should let it be known and make their opinions as the Canadians have done. And to repeat the disagreement that they have on political and moral issues with Israel, it matters. And I think I would say the moral decline may not be measurable in dollars and cents like exports to Germany, but it has a moral impact over time. And it influences Israelis to the point, even, I would say, Israelis choosing to emigrate. Partly because of what they see as where Israel is going in terms of its place in the international community, not to mention the ICJ, etc. So that's what are my 2 cents for, on that issue.
Okay, Mark, and then Shai, please.
Thank you, David. Aaron and Asher, thank you so much for your insightful analysis and contributions. I want to go back to something that Aaron referred to early on about interim agreements and refraining from actions that are continuing to portray a very negative environment. And this is probably more directed to Asher, but looking forward in what's going to happen in the current year in 2026 with the upcoming Israeli election. And Aaron, you actually referred to it in terms of possibility of Bennett being prime minister and so on. My thought or my question is framed in the following way. If it's possible that the opposition leaders can get their act together and coalesce in some way and actually take hold of the Israeli political situation post-Israeli election, is there a possibility of sort of moving the needle in some direction so that there are some, as Aaron talked about, interim agreements, but more importantly, signaling to the Arab world and particularly to the Palestinian community an openness and a readiness to engage in conversation with a renewed Palestinian leadership, and in doing so, encourage the Palestinian community to bring forth some renewed leadership that will actually engage with Israel going forward. Is that at all a possibility in the coming year?
If I look at the map of Israeli politics at present, an alternative government to Netanyahu's government presently after the elections will have to be a coalition that includes an Arab party. The opposition does not have and will not have, as things stand at present, and what the polls seem to be saying consistently, they will not have a majority without an Arab party. Mm-hmm. That in itself is, I would say in certain respects, almost revolutionary. We've had it before, but now we will have it again as a fixture of Israeli politics. That has huge impact on 2 things that we've been talking about. Israel as a democracy, rather than a discriminatory Jewish state where the Arabs are delegitimized as participants in government, as things stand at present. And the second part of your question, the openness to the idea of talking to the Palestinians. I think if the government will be stable and will be more lasting than the previous experience in a different government that we had a few years ago, then I think, we're on a different course. And I think things will improve greatly, both internationally and in Israel's general image and policy. The problem is that I'm not at all sure that that's going to happen. I wish I could say, this is what's going to be. Shortly after the 7th of October, I was convinced, absolutely convinced, that Netanyahu was finished. and that he couldn't possibly survive this disaster. Well, I was wrong, like so many other people here. And therefore, I'm very hesitant to say, what do we think is going to happen in the next elections? In the meantime, it doesn't appear that Netanyahu has a coalition, whereas the opposition does have a coalition, provided they include an Arab party. And that is a huge, I would say, trailblazer in terms of the points that we've been talking about.
Mark, if I could add one thing to what Asher says. I was in Israel on October 6th, 1973. Until October 7th, 2023, that was the greatest intelligence failure in the history of the Israeli state. It was the greatest trauma. And yet within 6 years of that trauma, I watched Sadat, Begin, and Carter sign a treaty of peace on the White House lawn. It took 6 years to produce, what's the word for earthquake in Hebrew? Adamah? Did I have it right?
Re'idat Adama. Re'idat Adama.
It took 6 years, and the earthquake was the emergence of a conservative Likud government. So, again, I think a Bennett-Lapid government would, I think, stop the excesses of Israel's annexationist policies. It would do a better job at controlling settler violence and terror. You'd have a different conversation. Instead of demonizing Palestinian citizens of Israel, there'd be an effort, and as Asher pointed out, you look at the polls, if the Arabs voted as a bloc, it's as high as 13 seats. Now, that includes 4 Arab parties who are much different complexion and ideology. But one has already demonstrated that it can participate. Not since the late 50s, I think, Asher, has any Arab party, they've supported governments from the outside, but not as a member of a coalition. I can see if you're in a hole, the stop digging process getting started. I can see a functional relationship with the Palestinian Authority instead of demonizing it. And security cooperation would continue. It's continuing now between the PA. I don't know about the future of the Palestinian National Movement. Hamas has survived. The Marwan Barghouti sort of white Palestinian hope is somehow out there. I mean, is there a Palestinian leader? I don't know, I'll say this. I'm not an Israeli. I don't play one on television. But if I were an Israeli and if I were interested in a serious negotiation, separation through negotiation, and the creation of a Palestinian state, I would demand that my interlocutor had one gun, one authority, and one negotiating position. A monopoly over the forces of violence within Palestinian society, which Arafat had, and I don't think in fact, the hundreds of hours spent with him, I don't think we ever really fundamentally understood. Oslo was the last concession he was prepared to make. But the monopoly over the forces of violence in Palestinian society, that's essential. And that's what you'd need. And on the Israeli side, I mean, I wouldn't even presume. I mean, Asher knows this subject better than I. I don't know what kind of where such a leader would come from. But yeah, much is possible. And that's why 2026 here at home and in Israel will produce hopefully 2 very consequential elections, which will at least move things in the right direction.
Yeah.
Thank you. I agree with that. Thank you.
I'm aware of our time, so Shai, please.
Thank you, David. Well, there are a lot of potential questions. I want to focus just on one thing and twist things a bit. Netanyahu knows that Trump is probably, as Aaron mentioned, his last hope in the US. He burned most of the bridges. He was doing that over the last 30 years. The thing is that Trump knows it as well. What is the likelihood that Trump because of Netanyahu dependency upon him, would support Netanyahu re-election to keep Netanyahu in a way in his pocket going forward.
I mean, there's no indication right now that Trump, and it's one of the great urban mythologies, of course, that we don't intervene in Israeli politics and they don't intervene in ours. I mean, it's frankly, it's crazy that people think that we don't. I mean, I worked for James Baker. He denied Shamir housing loan guarantees. It was one of the reasons mismanaging the U.S.-Israel relationship. Rabin replaced Shamir. Rabin got the $400 billion in loan guarantees by August of 1992. I watched Bill Clinton invite Shimon Peres to the White House in May before the June election. Didn't help. Benjamin Netanyahu became prime minister. Would Trump intercede against Netanyahu? That's the real question.
Oh.
And I think the answer there is probably not.
Mm-hmm.
To what degree would he make it unmistakably clear, since he's more popular in Israel than Benjamin Netanyahu is, that he is my guy?
Mm-hmm.
Could he shower Israel with a new 10-year memorandum of understanding on the security side and do other things, which he did in Trump 1.0,
Mm-hmm.
creating a sugar high for Israel, moving the embassy, declaring Jerusalem the capital, moving the embassy, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over Golan when even the Israeli government hasn't done that, ignoring settlement activity. I mean, the list went on and on and on and on. I don't see him running against Netanyahu.
Mm-hmm.
And providing Netanyahu plays by the rules between now and I'd like Asher's view on whether he thinks the government will go to term in October or whether or not we're going to get an election and why we would have one before October. I think he probably, since he knows he can manipulate Netanyahu, I think he'd probably support him, providing Netanyahu colors within Trump's lines.
But I think that's what most Israelis who do not support Netanyahu are concerned about.
Right. And I think they should be concerned because it's that relationship that is undermining democracies in both countries
Mm-hmm.
and the U.S.-Israeli relationship. And I might add, we haven't talked about this because I hate to draw causality here, but Jewish security, the security of Jews,
Mm-hmm.
has become much worse as a consequence of this. It raises the darker force of anti-Semitism, which we haven't talked about. So that's my read. He'll support Netanyahu as long as Netanyahu plays by the rules. To what degree he'll support him, I don't know.
So among the questions or comments that have been raised online, there has been reference to anti-Semitism and how this has spurned this, and depending on what Trump and Netanyahu do, perhaps how it could be made worse. There's a question having to do with the Palestinians, and do they not have responsibility for advancing peace, and what steps can they be taking? And related to that, there was the very first question that was raised was, what could be the sequence of events and actions that would stabilize and deal with the Palestinian issue? And I'm assuming that refers perhaps principally to the West Bank. I think you've addressed the Gaza issue, and I think that remains indeterminate. But there seems to be a thread of questions here that would really appreciate your thoughts on options for the Palestinians. Where is their leadership? How could they make a difference in all this? Does it require American back channel sponsorship and support. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Certainly one of the people who wrote in was quite caustic in terms of saying, you've spent nearly an hour blaming Israel. When will you speak of Palestinian responsibility?
I mean, that's a fair point. And I grapple with this issue and have grappled with it through almost 20 years of negotiations with Palestinians. And frankly, I never know quite how to answer it. I'm pulled between my conviction that the Palestinians are genuinely the weakest party to these negotiations. And yet October 7th has demonstrated with a frightening clarity the asymmetry, the power of the weak. The weak have tremendous power. Yes, Israel is strong. Israel can impose curfews, closures, land confiscation, settlement activity, targeted killings. Palestinians have the power of the weak, which is the power to deny their Israeli neighbors, presumably what the Israelis want most of all, which is not just security, but a real sense of security. October 7th demonstrated that. If you read the Tomorrow is Yesterday, extraordinary book, yes, co-written by my current friend and former colleague Rob Malley and Hussein Agha, Hussein argues, I know it's Hussein, that October 7th was not an aberration. Why do you think October 7th was an aberration? It was quintessentially Palestinian. Some argue it was like a prison break, and the inmates escaped jail and they went crazy. No, that's not my interpretation. This was an effort to inflict a degree of cruelty and pain unprecedented in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on Israeli civilians. It was a demonstration of the asymmetrical power of the weak. Do I think Palestinians have responsibilities for an agency? Yeah. I mean, 25 years ago, I was at Camp David. What Barak put on the table certainly was not enough to warrant a conflict-ending solution. And by the end of 2000, the Clinton parameters improved the Barak offer. Arafat wouldn't respond, anticipating he could get better from George W. Bush. You have Omer Abbas. Abbas did not respond, and that deal went even beyond the Clinton parameters. And you had Kerry Abbas, 2014. The Palestinian conception of their bottom line has been maintained pretty consistently. But again, Hussein Agha and Robert Malley, the problem is not 1967 for many, many, many Palestinians.
48.
Yeah, it's 1948. And if that is in fact the case,
yeah,
where's the margin there for a negotiated deal? So I mean, it's not a caustic comment. It's a reflection of Palestinians failing to respond, in my judgment. I mean, I saw a lot of this up close and personal. Asher, though, I'm not living there. You are dealing with the consequences of. What's your view?
I have written a lot about, the distinction between the 1948 questions and the 1967 questions. And indeed, the problem is the 1948 questions, for which Israel has no answer. And the Palestinians have yet to come to a position where they are willing to compromise on that. However, looking at the situation on the ground at present, Israel must focus first and foremost not on the Palestinian question because it's doing someone a favor. Israel has to focus on the Palestinian question for Israel's own sake in the long run.
Yeah.
What are we doing here? Israel was created to be the nation state of the Jewish people and a legitimate member of the family of nations. If we continue the occupation, we will be neither. That's the grim reality. And we cannot sit back and say, well, you know, the Palestinians and the Palestinians. Yeah, true, we have a problem. And we both Aaron and I have spoken about the fact that there's no final agreement waiting for us in the back room. Clear, that's true. But it requires Israel's own self-interest. Requires Israel to refrain and, on the other hand, to do what needs to be done to preserve Israel's raison d'etre, the nation state of the Jewish people and a legitimate member of the family of nations. And we cannot do that with the occupation.
Let me, on behalf of everyone who's participated and who will benefit when they listen and view the recording, to thank you both for an exceptional 90 minutes plus. You've taught us a lot. I think you probably annoyed a lot of people because they're looking for clear answers. And to these complex problems, these puzzles, there are no clear and unambiguous answers, it seems. I think we're going to have to, with your tolerance, invite you both back post the American and the Israeli elections, and to consider how new governments might make a difference, and where if anywhere, new pathways may be found. So thank you both very, very, very much for sharing your insights, your wisdom, and of course, considerable amount of your time. We're grateful.
David, I want to thank you first for understanding these are complicated issues and allowing, I know we didn't get enough questions in largely because I only take responsibility. I talk too much, but for creating the time required to do this. And again, to Asher, I can only say the greatest compliment I can pay you, Asher, is that, again, your capacity to take complicated situations and assess them with detachment and yet with passion, I find just remarkable. And we don't talk much anymore, but I've learned so much from you. And I can't tell you how much I benefited from this conversation, David. It hasn't been a one-way street as far as I'm concerned. It's a two-way street. I want to thank David. Thank you for making that possible. And Asher, thank you for, well, I guess being you.
Thank you, Aaron. I can only say, I thank David for bringing us together. And thank you for being Aaron and for the brilliance that you bring to the table. I mean, I've known this for, I think, 50 years about. When we met as young people one day in Washington, and you have always been in my mind the go-to name. Aaron is the guy. And it's an honor to be with you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Asher.
For all our viewers, if you're not aware, you may want to go on the website for the Carnegie Endowment, International Peace, and seek out Aaron's regular webinar, which brings together experts on a range of very important international issues on a regular basis. And Aaron serves as the moderator. And I think everyone would find it of enormous value. So with that, Thank you all. Let me remind you that in 2 weeks, we'll reconvene. We have another Israel dialogue session. This will be with a young female Israeli academic who specializes on conflict management. And she'll be drawing from her research a number of case studies and applying it to Israel and the Palestinians. So that's in about 2 weeks. Les, do you have anything to add on behalf of Holy Blossom?
Oh, just thank you everyone for doing that on behalf of Holy Blossom. This has been a great session, and we're going to have more great sessions coming up. So mark your calendars, and Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Goodbye.
Thank you all. Aaron and
Bye-bye.
Usher, good of you
Bye-bye.
both.
Thank you.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much.
Bye.